morning, everyone. If you're coming in, please come in and grab a seat. There are empty seats kind of up in this general area. Over here too if you're looking for a seat. So this class, as we discussed on Monday, has a new format of guest lectures. So we have our first guest lecturer here today, and we're very honored to have him. He is the author of your textbook, and he is also a distinguished professor here at Purdue. So to introduce psychology to you, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Jim Nairne.
Okay, well, it's great to be here. You're looking good. You're looking a little bit tired maybe, but it's great to be here. As Dr. LeBreton said, I'm Jim Nairne, and I'm here to introduce you to the topic of psychology. I bet most of you have taken a psychology class before, correct? So raise your hand if you've taken a psychology class before, maybe in high school, or some of you are here for the third or fourth time at Purdue, because you took Psych 120 and didn't do well. But the vast majority of you have had some exposure to psychology, correct? So you think you have a pretty good idea of what it is, right? Well, I've been teaching this course for a long time, a couple decades actually. And one of the things that I do at the beginning of the course is I ask you what you expect to learn in psychology, because that gives me some insight into what you think psychology might be. So I could do that to you. I'm not going to take the time in this class to do it, but you can think about it for a moment. What are the top 3 things that you expect to learn in your psychology class here? Think about that for a second. Well, as I said, I've done this little exercise a lot over the years, and let me just put up some of the answers that I've gotten. So see, these are some of the things that people expect to learn in their introductory psychology class. Why do people do things that are wrong or dangerous? Why are some teenagers rebellious? What do dreams mean? Why do people develop public persona or masks? Why do people hide their true feelings? How can people, this is my personal favorite, how can people do exceptional things in emergencies, like lifting a car? Any of you have that one? What causes multiple personality disorder? Why do people end up marrying someone like their parents? This seem like a reasonable representation of what you'd like to learn in a class like this? Well, unfortunately, these are not the types of things that you're going to get answers to. In fact, looking at this list, I don't think I know the answer to any of these particular questions. Some of them will be discussed in this class, but for the most part, this is not the type of thing that you're going to be learning about. And you're going to hear this theme repeated throughout today's lecture. So let's start by talking about what psychology is. And I can give you a definition of the term psychology. It comes from the Greek psyche, meaning soul or breath. You can think of it as sort of mind or soul. And whenever you see ology at the end of a word, that means the study of or discourse on. So if you take biology, that's the study of or a discourse on life, bios. So psychology is the study of or discourse on the soul or the mind. In fact, if you were to go back and look at psychology textbooks when psychology was first created in the latter part of the 19th century, you would find that psychology was thought to be the study of immediate conscious experience. Well, that definition of the study of the mind is true today, but there's been a shift over the last 100 years toward a scientific analysis of the mind. So the technical definition of psychology today is the scientific study of behavior and mind. Well, by scientific, we mean that we rely on observation as our Supreme Court of Appeal. And you'll read more about that in the chapter on methods, and you'll hear lectures on the scientific method. But for the most part, the scientific method involves observing, looking at the world, detecting regularities among those observations, then generating hypotheses or predictions based on those observations, and then finally testing those observations, testing those hypotheses or predictions through further observations. That's the kind of rudimentary, simple, four-step version of the scientific method. So psychology is a science, and we study, using the scientific method, how people act, behave, and think. But there's two problems with this that we have to face that some of the other sciences don't have to face. The first is, most people don't think that this is possible. So the idea that you could have a scientific explanation for human behavior seems impossible to the average person, probably to you, because you believe inside that you have free will over your behavior and that nobody is going to be able to predict how you're going to act and behave because you're the one that's deciding how to do it. So, for instance, I can do this or this. How could you ever predict that? I'm sitting here internally in this little mind locked inside a body that maybe you can understand, and I'm making all these kinds of decisions. How could you ever subject that to the scientific method? Impossible. That's what many people think. And this is a deep bias that people have. People think that psychology can never really be a science. And you find this all over the place. I'll give you an example. We're going to be talking in here from time to time about animal studies. So there's a lot of work done in psychology using animals, maybe some other primates or rats or so on. And a lot of times people's reaction to that is, oh, well, you can't tell me about my behavior based on the behavior of a rat or a drooling dog. Anybody ever had that thought? Raise your hand if you think that may be valid. Well, it's often said, you can't tell about a human based on the study of a rat. Well, the same person that says that reads an article on Wikipedia or Googles and finds that if you feed too much red dye number 2 to cockroaches, they get cancer of the feeler. And they say, I'm not eating red M&Ms anymore. That same person goes to their biology or genetics class and learns about the structure of genetics based on a pea plant, for God's sakes, and goes home and says, oh, wow, you know, it's really interesting how our genes work. Like they split and there's this meiosis, and they learned all that because they studied pea plants. And that's okay. That's cool. But if I were to try to tell you anything about how you think, act, and feel based on a rat or a pea plant or a drooling dog, no way, man. No way. You can't do that. Hey, look at this. You predict this, man. You predict this. This is a dilemma for psychologists. One of the things that you'll see throughout this course is that, in fact, we can predict a lot about your behavior, and not only about your behavior, but about the way you think. We can even tell what goes on inside your head. You're going to see me again later on in the semester, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to talk about memory. And one of the things that I'm going to do is that I'm going to convince you that you really don't store memories inside your head the way you think you do. In fact,
I will be able to get you to remember something that didn't occur. In fact, you will be more convinced that something occurred that didn't occur than something that I actually did give to you. And this is a piece of cake. I know you don't believe me, but that's going to come later. So, regardless of your particular biases about psychology as a science, it is, and we use the scientific method. Well, I said there were two problems. The first is a kind of bias, the free will, the mind, you have control over your own behavior. But the second problem is, how can you apply, and this is a serious one, how can you apply the scientific method, which is based on observation, to something that's unobservable? Your mind. I can't see it. I could chop your head open with an axe. I could do that, and I could look inside, but all I would see was a bunch of neurons and glial cells and blood. I wouldn't see any thoughts. So how do you do this? How can you study something that's inherently unobservable? Tough. Well, it turns out that we can, in fact, if we're clever enough, use techniques to figure out what you're thinking. We can do it in a variety of ways. One way we can do it is by physiological mechanisms or methods. So I can hook you up to devices that actually show me how your brain changes as you think. There's things called EEGs. There's things called functional magnetic resonance imaging devices that can actually look inside your brain and show how your neurons are active when you're doing different things. So when you're thinking about X, there's a different pattern of activation in your brain than when you're thinking about Y. And if you're suffering from a psychological problem, your pattern of electromagnetic energy, you know, your brain emits all kinds of electrical stuff all the time. You'll learn about that when you get to the part about how your brain works. All kinds of electrical activity emanating from your brain, and we can measure it. And we can look to see how your patterns of activation that you emanate are different from other people. So if you're depressed, do the patterns of electrical magnetic energy that you emanate look more like people that have been depressed or people that are normal? And I can actually use that comparison to diagnose your brain, your mental state, by looking at the patterns of electrical activity that you're emanating. I can also do it behaviorally. So, for instance, I know a little bit about what's going on inside your head right now. So, let me ask you this question. You're thinking right now. Think for me. Think. What is going on in there? Think about, look inside your head right now. You know, you're in there and you're saying to yourself, what the heck is this guy talking about? You know, whatever that is in there, describe it. Is it a bunch of pictures? Are you having images floating by inside your head? Well, actually, I can tell you what's going on in there. And I can do it behaviorally. I can't tell you the content, but I can tell you what it is. It's a voice. You actually have a voice inside your head. You do. So count to 10 inside your head right now. Can you do that? Do you hear it? Hear it? It's a voice. How do I know it's a voice? I can actually do experiments that tell me it's a voice. I can look in the activity portions of your brain, and you know what lights up? You know what neurons are active when you're doing that? When you're going, I really hate this guy. You know, this class sucks. That little thing that's going on right now, I can look inside your brain with an fMRI, and what I'm going to find is activation in the same areas of your brain that light up when you physically speak. Same part of your brain. When people with schizophrenia have an auditory hallucination, what part of the brain activates? The speech parts of your brain. Do I take questions? I'm going to come back and give a lecture. He's asking me, what about people who are born deaf? And I'm going to come back into this classroom and I'm going to give you a lecture later on in memory. And the title of that lecture is, Do Dogs Have an Inner Bark? Do deaf people... I have an answer to that question, but you're going to have to wait. Okay? The answer in a nutshell is it depends on whether they know how to speak. If they don't, they don't. They have inner, whatever their mode of communication is, like ASL. If they know how to speak, they have an inner voice. But let me give you one other example of how I might know you have a voice inside your head. Do you know that if I present you with a tape recording of somebody who speaks really quickly, and I say, okay, I want you to listen to this person talk. This person talks extremely rapidly. I want you to listen to this person talk for a while, okay? You understand what this person is talking about? Okay. You listen to this guy for 5 minutes. Then I give you another tape, and it's a person reading, talking really slowly, like, yeah, well, yeah, I reckon that could be. Yeah, well. Listen to that for 5 minutes. Then I give you a letter. And I say, I want you to read this letter. And I tell you, the letter was written by the guy that speaks really quickly or the guy that speaks really slowly. You're just reading the letter. Do you know that when you think the letter is written by the guy that speaks really quickly, you read it much faster than if you think it's written by the guy that speaks really slowly? If I test your memory for things, like suppose I gave you a list of letters to remember, like ready, Q, R, L, M, P, A, B, C, D, E, L, M, recall. I'm waiting. Anyway, if I look at what kinds of mistakes you make, let's say one of the letters was the letter C, and you don't get it right, I can look at what kind of error you make. So if you actually formed a visual image or a picture of something inside your head when you're thinking, then if you made a mistake on the letter C, I would expect you to mistake it with something that looks like the letter C. But you don't. You know what you do? You always substitute something that sounds like the letter C, like T. T doesn't look anything like C, but that's what you say. I'll come back to this later. But you have an inner voice inside your head, and we can study it. I'm going to skip that. Well, back on psychology. You know, I'm a psychologist in a way. I'm a professor of psychology. If you're taking a psychology class like you all are, and you have some roommate, and you go back there and you say, I'm taking psychology, what do they say to you? Well, let's take me then. If I'm out somewhere and somebody says, oh, what do you do for a living? And I say, I'm a psychologist. What do you think they say? They go, oh, God, man. I better watch what I say around you, boy. You know, like, wow. Or, even worse, they go, you're a psychologist? Come here. I've been having this dream, like, I can't, it's about this poodle, and like, I can't. That's worse, believe me. But in both cases, the assumption is that psychologists study mental disorders, that we are essentially involved in the study of mental disorders, clinical work. We see patients or clients, and we help them with their adjustment or psychological problems. That's only one type of psychologist. And it's important for you to understand that there are really more than one type of psychologist. And in fact, most of the stuff that you're going to be learning about in this course won't have anything to do with clinical psychology. In fact, you're not even going to get to that part of the course till probably, what, April? So what's going to happen the rest of the time? Well, you're going to learn about the work that's been done by people who do research on the mind and people who apply psychology. So there are three types of psychologists: clinical psychologists, applied psychologists, and research psychologists. I'm a research psychologist. Most of the people that you're going to run into at universities are research psychologists. So we're studying the fundamental processes of the mind. We're not actually seeing patients and helping people with their problems. Let me go through each of these in a little bit more detail because I think you'll be surprised. Okay, so let's start with the main one, which is clinical psychology. Clinical psychologists are people that are interested in understanding, diagnosing, and treating psychological problems. That's what a clinical psychologist does. Clinical psychologists have PhDs or PsyDs, and technically, clinical psychologists are often required to go through a licensing process, and it's actually quite a difficult and extensive process to go through. So they have to have hours and hours and hours of supervised training and so on. So a clinical psychologist is someone who focuses on understanding, diagnosing, and treating psychological problems. Counseling psychologists focus more on family and adjustment issues. So they're not really dealing with major clinical syndromes so much like schizophrenia or depression or anxiety, but instead they're focusing on adjustment issues, marriage problems, and so on. So you might go to a counseling psychologist for a problem like that. And most important is the distinction between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. How many feel like they understand the difference? Or did understand the difference? A psychiatrist is a medical doctor. A psychiatrist is a physician. A psychiatrist is someone that goes to medical school, graduates with an MD, goes on, does a residency, and specializes in diagnosing and treating psychological problems. There really is very little, if any, difference between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist, except for the training. The psychiatrist goes to medical school. The clinical psychologist goes to a clinical psychology program, gets a PhD, goes on, does further fellowship work and further training after that, and gets licensed, just like a medical doctor would get licensed. The big difference used to be more of a difference in the old days. Used to be that psychiatrists tended to practice psychoanalytic or Freudian type analysis. But now it's pretty much there's no difference between psychiatrists and clinical psychologists in their basic approach to psychological disorders. The only big difference, besides the training, is that psychiatrists can prescribe drugs. So they're medical doctors and they can prescribe drugs. Now, there are some states that allow clinical psychologists to prescribe drugs, and that is something that's constantly being debated in the United States. And eventually, clinical psychologists will be able to prescribe drugs everywhere, but they can't right now. So oftentimes when there's a medical issue, so there's a lot of medical, or a lot of prescription drugs that are used to treat psychological disorders, like half of you are on Lexapro Zoloft or something like that. It's a very commonly prescribed thing, although most of the time those antidepressive drugs or anti-anxiety drugs like Klonopin are prescribed by your family physician, which if I were teaching clinical in here, I'd have a lot more to say on, but so psychiatrists, they're medical doctors, they can prescribe drugs. Okay. Let's talk about applied psychologists. Applied psychologists are interested in applying psychology to practical problems in the real world. And they can work in a variety of different settings. For example, there are school psychologists. You probably had one. There are people that specialize in educational settings, maybe helping people adjust to classrooms or doing assessment techniques to find out maybe what the best sort of career might be for you. They do career counseling. There are industrial organizational psychologists who are actually in the workplace. So it turns out that there's a whole kind of methodology associated with assessing things like job satisfaction. And it's important to know whether or not your employees like their work. It's important to know whether or not the structure that you have in your company, the management system, is effective in producing good work behavior, that people are happy and they're productive. So industrial organizational psychologists will worry about assessment techniques. They'll worry about job satisfaction. They'll worry about how to organize the structure of a work environment to maximize productivity and so on. You'll hear a lot about that later in the course. And finally, I'll just give you one more example, and it's human factors psychologists. And human factors psychologists work in industry. How many in here are engineers? Well, you know, there's a branch of engineering called industrial engineering. And a lot of the people that work in industrial engineering are, in fact, psychologists. And they work on how to design equipment so that people can actually use it. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Like the telephone company. Do you know that AT&T, when it was Bell Laboratories, was one of the largest employers of psychologists? Why would the telephone company want to hire a psychologist? Well, think about it. Why are telephone numbers 7 digits long? I mean, if you're designing a telephone number, you want to make it so that it's long enough that there's enough information that everybody can have their own telephone number. But you don't want to make it so long that nobody can remember it. So let's do a little experiment in here just for me to show you this, okay? I want you to remember, I'm going to say to you a list of digits, and I want you to recall them back, okay? Here we go. Ready? 219. Recall.
219.
That's pretty easy. So we could make a telephone number 219, but the problem with that is we'd quickly, there'd be a lot of people that add a 219, right? Can't do 3, you have to do more than 3. So let's do more than 3. Ready? 2, 4, 8, 5, 7, 9, 4, 6, 1, 2, recall. 2, 4, 1, 6, 3. Well, that's not going to work. So if you have one that's 9 digits long, that's not going to work because you're going to forget it, or you're going to start making errors, and you're going to start calling the wrong people. And if you start calling the wrong people, we don't like that, do we? We all get calls from people all the time, right, that are wrong numbers. So we got to find that point. We got to titrate the length of the telephone number so that you can remember it. And it turns out that the magic number is 7. How long are telephone numbers? 447-9135. Okay? Not an accident. Why do we put a pause there? Why do we go 447-5232? Not an accident. The psychologist told them to do it that way. In fact, when I got out of graduate school, I was recruited by Bell Laboratories, and here was the problem that they wanted me to work on. This was at a point where they were moving to automated information. So you could dial information, right? And in the old days, when I was a kid, you got a real person, okay? And they didn't want to do that. They wanted to move to a system that was automated. But they were worried about whether people would use it or not. So some poor little old lady in Iowa dials information and gets, the number is 4 and 2, 3 and 5. You know, she throws it down, doesn't use the system. AT&T loses millions of dollars. So they wanted me to actually do research on how people would react to automated information systems. And they were going to pay me a lot of money to do that. Doesn't sound like something a psychologist would do, does it? But that's what they do. Why do you suppose traffic lights are red and green? Have you ever thought about that? Is that an accident? Did somebody just pick that up? Oh, you know, hey, red, green, seems like good colors, you know, they're easy to see. Why are they red and green? Not an accident. Psychology has things to say about how to design doors. Doors. The reason is because it's human beings interacting with equipment. You ever seen a door? I'll draw one up on the board just so that you can see it. In my parking garage, there's a door, and it has a bar that looks like that. How many have seen a door like that? Raise your hand. Come on, you've seen a door like that. They're all over the place. Now, you've interacted with doors like that. We have to interact with doors like that every day. How many of you have ever gone into the door like this to open it because your hands are full of something and hit the wrong side? Raise your hand if that's happened to you. Is that because you're stupid? No, it's because that door has not been designed in a way that affords interacting with a human being. There's no way to figure out how that works. It's even worse. If you go over to, and I believe they just put in new doors on Stewart Center, and I'm not sure whether these are still like that or not, but I'll tell you what they used to be like. Have a big flat panel. You go up to that like a normal human and you do this and you get kicked back because you have to pull on that door. Well, If the person that designed that door knew anything about human psychology, they would have understood that flat things afford pushing. So when the human being sees a flat thing, naturally the inclination is to go like this. You have to pull it. That is a bad design. Okay? Write President Cordova about that. In fact, it's so bad that you really know it's bad when you see a door like that and they've written pull. That's when you really know that it's a bad design. We're only talking doors here. I'm going to talk a little bit about stoves, but we're going to only talk about doors and stoves here. But imagine computers. Imagine the cockpit of an F-16. Another job I got offered, General Dynamics in Fort Worth. They wanted to know whether it was efficient to color code the cockpit of a fighter jet. Me, psychologist. Now let's talk about stoves. So you have a stove, right? You've never used it, but you've got one, right? Now, most stoves are designed like this. They have 4 burners, right? You with me? And then they've got knobs. And say the knobs might be up here, okay? Or they may be down here. That is a horrible design. How many have a stove like that? Raise your hand high. Almost all of you have a stove like that. That is a horrible design from a psychological standpoint. And I can prove it to you. How many of you have put on a pot of water to boil and turned on the burner and come back later and realize that you've turned on the wrong burner? How many have done that? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Oh, I don't do that. I'm an engineer. Like, I read the manual. It's bad design. And the reason why it's bad design is because there's no natural mapping between those controls and the burners. When you look at this, is that supposed to go with this one or that one? In fact, I can do experiments on this, and I can predict exactly the proportion of time that you're going to make the wrong choice on burner based on the design. Do you think it would be worthwhile for General Electric to hire a few people that knew something about psychology? Yes, they do. And do you know that the head of research at Apple, great human factors company, do you know that the head of research at Apple for many years was a psychologist? Not an accident. So, if I were to design a stove, the one on the left is an example of a bad stove because there's no mapping. The one in the middle is a design of a decent. In fact, if I look at errors that are made, you're much less likely to make an error on the middle stove. Why? Because there's a natural mapping. Can't see this, but there's a natural mapping. So you know the one on the left goes to the far left, the second one from the left goes to the second from the left, and then the far right one is another way. Now, has anybody ever seen a stove designed this way? Yeah, and what stoves are designed this way? The expensive ones. The ones that you pay thousands and thousands of dollars for are designed that way. So, okay. The third type of psychologist, and I hope you find that interesting. I mean, a lot of you probably never thought that psychologists would be involved in something like the design of doors and stoves, but they are. The third type of psychologist is a research psychologist. And these are the people that are actually in the laboratory doing experiments, trying to figure out how your brain and your mind and your behavior work. And there are different specialties. There are neuroscientists who are working on the physiological or neural determinants of behavior. You'll hear a lot about that in this course. There are people that study personality. What is personality? Ever tried to think about what that concept means? What is personality? How can I measure it? Well, to give you a little hint, personality, if you think about it, is a tendency of a person to act similarly across situations. If you changed your behavior in every situation you were shy in one and you were outgoing in another, I mean, if you always changed depending on the situation, there wouldn't be a concept of personality. Personality is the tendency to remain consistent across situations. And that's what we call an individual difference. So people differ in their personality structure. And it turns out that wherever you go in the world, you can describe somebody's personality along 5 basic dimensions called the Big Five. And you'll hear about that later in the course. There are cognitive psychologists. And cognitive psychologists are people like me who study memory and reasoning and perception. And you'll hear a lot more, and stoves and things like that. You'll hear a lot more about that. I'll talk about memory when I come back in here later in March. There are developmental psychologists. Developmental psychologists study, not surprisingly, how behavior and mind changes throughout development. So, are little kids just adultlets? I mean, are little kids, do they just not know as much? Or are they fundamentally different beings? It turns out that they kind of are. They're sort of like viewing the world differently than you do. So little kids, one of the reasons why you can't remember anything that you were doing when you were 1 or 2 is because your mind was different. When you were 1 year old, a lot of what you were doing was viewing the world in terms of how to suck things. So if you hand something to a 8-month-old, what do? They put it in their mouth. Is that because they're hungry? The 10-year-old doesn't put it in the mouth. Why does the 1-year-old put it in the mouth? Because that's one of the ways they explore the world. In fact, you can compare a child's knowledge of an object that's been mouthed by that child or not mouthed by that child, and the kid that mouthed it knows more about it. So they actually use that as a way of understanding the world. But they're different. They're like little aliens in many respects. So for instance, you take an average 4-year-old, give them 2 balls. And you have them little balls of clay, and you have it so they have exactly the same amount of clay. And you say to the little 4-year-old or 5-year-old, do these have the same amount of clay in them? And and eventually they'll say, yeah. Then you put one of the clay balls down. Do this. You have a little brother, right? Do this. Put one of the balls down. Take the other one into like a sausage shape. Hold that. Pick up the other ball. Which one has more clay? I'm asking you. Which one has more clay? You're confused by this. Well, they have the same amount of clay, folks. You can change the properties. The guy in the back's going, well, I think the snake one does. You can change okay? The kid will say one has more than the other. If you then put down the ball, take the snake and roll it back up to a ball and put it and say which one has more clay, they go, we just did that. They're the same. You don't think that way. Let me give you another example. Suppose you take 2 glasses of water. Okay? And you take one of them and you pour it into a tall, thin glass. So that now the height of the water, they were the same before, and now this one's way up here because it's a thin glass. Which one has more water? Correct answer? The same. Little kid? Different. They're aliens. They're not adultlets. You take M&Ms. Take 5 M&Ms, put them in a line. Take another 5 M&Ms, put them in a line but space them out. Which one do they want? They want the longer one. You need to think about development, and you'll hear a lot about development in here, and I'm not going to be teaching that section, but you'll hear a lot about it. You know how when you watch a television channel and you turn the channel? Well, I'd still do this because when I grew up you actually did turn the channel, but they don't do that anymore. You do this. Well, what physically happens when you go from one channel to the next? You don't know. Well, electromagnetic energy that's being broadcast by the stations is all here right now. And the television is designed to filter. It sets itself up structurally so that only certain bands of that electromagnetic energy get translated into a picture. Then when you change the channel, what you're doing is changing the structure, the filter, so now it's accepting a different range of electromagnetic or whatever the thing is that you're listening to, or it could be sound waves, whatever. You understand that? The structure is determining what you see of the TV. Well, you can think about the brain the same way. So it's as if you're watching channel 6 and the little kid is watching channel 13. The world is different. This same thing applies to mental disorders. So when somebody's depressed, their filter is set differently. So when you're not depressed, stuff comes in. Most of it's good, some of it's bad, a lot of it's neutral. But when you get depressed, the filter shifts. So now what comes in is interpreted negatively. So you can think about things like development and mental illness as changes in the structure of how you process information. And developmental psychologists study that type of thing. Okay, I'm out of time for today. I will be back on Friday, and I will tell you more about how psychologists think.